we want to do in the next 15 to 20 minutes is have you all self-select group, form yourselves into 3 separate groups. We can have a group over here, we can have a group here in the middle, and a group here at this side. And we'd like to have you focus, for this group over here, focus on the planning environmental clearance issues that were addressed earlier this morning, and devise amongst yourselves a strategy for addressing some of those concerns and issues that were raised. And we want you to identify a secretary for your group and a spokesman for your group, and then after you finish your deliberations in about 20 minutes or so, we're going to have you report back on what your recommendations were. For the group here in the middle, we want to focus on the funding and finance of intercity and high-speed rail systems. Again, come together, select a secretary who will sort of keep track of what's being said in the group, and somebody who will report back. And then over here, focus on the leadership and governance issues. Again, select a secretary to keep notes of what the discussion is, and someone who will report back. That reporting back will give us an agenda, which then we hope will be a series of action items that will be addressed by the APTA Intercity Passenger Rail Committee, and an action plan that will actually help produce strategies, will produce initiatives that will help us, if not get to the tipping point, get beyond the tipping point as we make our efforts to ensure that the momentum that has been obtained through the passage of the FAST Act and its inclusion of a rail title will not be a lost adventure, but in fact will be the first of many steps that will continue to our success in bringing about a renaissance in passenger rail and the development of true high-speed rail in specific corridors across the U.S. So if you can break yourselves into select whichever one of the groups you want to go to, talk amongst yourself for 15, 20 minutes, and we'll call you back to have you report back.
Why don't you give an actual time when we're going to stop?
Okay, what time is it now?
It's 1:35.
Okay, let's come back by 5 minutes of 2.
Over there, aren't you?
Should be business oriented. We decided that Buy America should be reformed, and the objective should be to create sustainable jobs. We also talked about in FAST, if there's consideration for grant programs in the legislation, that they should consider multi-year funding commitments. And most rail services across different states, so they are across different states, so there should be a regional requirement instead of a state requirement for their rail plans.
Hi, I'm Dominic DeBrito, Vice President of International Operations for LTK Engineering. Our group was focused on governance and leadership, and this was a really tough one. The first thing that was obvious was that it starts at the top. We do need a champion, but it needs to be a less partisan champion, so that the two parties don't have an opportunity to use this as a dividing line. Second, it requires political will, and this is where at the federal level it has to happen. And when we look at examples of where political will was effective, it can work, and certainly the federal highway system is a good example. It's an older example, but it was a similar. It took a federal political will to make that happen. And if we look at where high-speed rail is really advancing worldwide, it's definitely about political will, both at the federal level and to a citizen as well. People are behind it. 3, there are some existing models here in the United States for governance of interstate systems, whether they be utilities, highways, or the aviation industry. But the problem is that there are nuances about rail systems that wouldn't allow us to just take one of those models and plunk it down and say that's going to work for us as well. But they certainly can form the basis or the starting point for a governance model for high-speed rail or an interstate high-speed rail program. And the final thing is, it's not just about governance at a national level. It's about national, state, and local. And we saw some good approaches to making sure that everyone gets a seat at the table. The Lausanne example, I think, is a great example of how you can make sure that that at the local level there is a voice, and it isn't a voice that's divisive. They're not bickering amongst themselves and manage to kill, hopefully, and manage to kill the project. And this is the key there is a governance structure that allows everyone a seat at the table, but doesn't allow a project to get killed because that process stretches out the length primarily of the process. All obvious, but consolidated in a nutshell.
Thank you, Dominic. Perhaps we can open this up just for a few minutes for some discussion, questions of any of the three reporters, other observations that might enhance some of the suggestions that have been brought forward from each of the groups. Ross?
I just had a question. Was a reference to a bill dealing with regulatory timelines among different agencies. Is that part of the FAST Act, or is that a different bill?
No, that was on the wish list.
That was just the wish list.
There are some changes in MAP 21 which change the mandated time in which you can litigate against the NEPA decision, but it's a number of days reduction. It's not a number of years.
Peter?
Mike Beck on NEPA seems to be a lightning rod issue. and it, you know, it's come up in California and it's come up, I think, nationally about fixing NEPA, right? And it just is a very toxic issue because it seems like it brings out that we're trying to kill NEPA. That we're trying, you know, it brings out the environmentalists to thinking that there's some sort of a conspiracy to get rid of NEPA around this. But I think within the community, within the industry, there's a real recognition that there need, like you called it, the inflexibility of NEPA, right? Or the ability of other federal agencies to have a consistent, standardized approach and consolidate that approach and more unified approach. And any comment on that about, I mean, can we ever get around the discussion of beyond the conspiracy theory that we're trying to get rid of environmental regulation and actually have a real discussion about how to fix it?
Yeah, I think that's going to be very hard to do, in my opinion, as a practitioner, because it's not, don't take it personally, it's not high-speed rail. It's the NEPA program is going across every action of the federal government or an applicant to the federal government. So it is, you'll have to frame the conversation to not be a takeaway. We've been using the term streamlining for about 15 years now. I think you're going to have to find ways, in my opinion, to move some decisions into the permitting process, other decisions earlier into the planning process, to get the NEPA process more defined. The other thought that's emerging, and you all know more than I do in the construction world about how design, build, and alternative delivery are affecting things. You might also have to take the idea that NEPA only gets you so far and understand that NEPA becomes an incremental decision-making tool, and you only make certain decisions at the upfront so that an investor would have enough comfort to move forward and understanding that point. Those are some initial thoughts.
Let me follow up on that, Mike. You know, I don't know if it's so much the NEPA process as it is the allowable litigation.
Right.
I mean, many of the EU countries have processes, Germany, have processes that are every bit as rigorous as we do in the US. But the approach to allowable litigation and the time frames at which one can sue, the statutes of limitation and so forth, are much different. So it seems to me that we're focusing on perhaps the wrong thing when we talk about streamlining per se. I mean, focus on ways in which we can eliminate the ability to draw out the process to litigation and keep the rigor of the environmental process. I mean, I'm sure that that's been discussed before in legal circles, but does that have any traction, that sort of approach to dealing with it?
You see the early starts to do that with these MAP 21 changes. Couple of things as examples, which are early starts in my opinion at that, are the combining the publication of the final EIS with the record of decision. That's an attempt to shorten the process, which really, in other words, means get me to litigation earlier, which is most of my clients really want the draft document on the street. They want to get to ROD so they can get to litigation, because that takes just as long or longer than the NEPA process. That's one indication. The other is the provisions in the new MAP 21 rules that reduce the time, the statute of limitations on litigation from the 180 days, I think, down to 135 days now, I think, were some of the recommendations that are in the rulemaking now. Another perspective is to look at how NEPA is compared to mini NEPAs. From Dominic and I in the California experience, people are suing on CEQA, not as much NEPA. Threshold is lower. It's easier to attack there, so that gives some credence to your concept that if you make the threshold higher, focused on NEPA, not the public involvement process. I like it, I don't like it. And you're looking for, I say yes, but I really mean I sue on noise, but I'm really concerned about stopping the project or my property value. So there are some ways around it. CEQA has a process to where you have to prove you have standing to litigate. So, that's another way to look at. Could you make it more streamlined, more precise about do I have standing?
It's also the queue to get into court. Maybe you're gonna have a NEPA court.
I want one of those for California for CEQA. That's my Christmas wish.
Joe?
Yeah, I remember the congressional testimony on NEPA, hearing it like right out of the witness's mouth, and going through the NEPA process, 15 government agencies involved, and 15 government agencies contradicting each one of their statements. So how do you even get through the process when you've got 15 government agencies actually fighting with themselves about what they want done in the project?
I respond and say hire me, but yeah, that's again, it's the regulators. I think Congress has to actually show leadership there too. What do they want the voice to be? When you're doing that process, you are balancing different values and mandates of agencies, be they trustees of endangered species or be they funding agencies, making sure we went through the process. So in many ways, the federal process feeds on itself. The builder agencies need to be taxed with mitigation measures to fund the needs of the trustee agencies. So if we rethought how we resource the overall process, then those issues, in my opinion, would be much softer. Ask something else. I'm going to ask for speakers to be at this.
Last word. Any other comments or questions or perspectives? So, as I said at the outset of this part of our program, our hope was to come up with an inventory of actionable items that we could perhaps either add to the 22 principles that have already been adopted, or that could be used to pursue any of those 22 principles that have not yet been achieved. Any expression from any of you with regard to the actionability of the recommendations that have been put forward here in these past few minutes, or anything else that we ought to be thinking about with regard to the implementation of those principles.
Seems to me by nature of the fact that all the questions came to mind, that we think it's helpless to deal with funding and governance, but we have some opportunity in the environmental and streamlining areas. Is that true?
Never.
Never hopeless?
Never.
I would say there are opportunities that practitioners see, absolutely. And I think it gets more complicated with the changing version. Someone mentioned how hard it is to do NEPA for mega projects, and NEPA does need to be rethought. But again, I would link it back to the ground up consensus process will make all these processes go quickly. Some of us here worked on the Doyle Drive project, which was California's first design build P3 project. And in the environmental phase, we all said, we truly believe that if we could actually, on a project this contentious, get a record of decision, money would fall from the sky. And it did, and it's not real money, in my opinion. But, so there's room across that process for improvements. And I think maybe a subject to think about as a subcommittee structure or discussion is something I'd be excited about.
In our group, we had a lot of great ideas, but there are two intriguing ideas that stuck with me, which was redefining the objective of Buy America, that it's misdirected, and it's as a result of the Buy America clause, it's limiting our ability to attract innovation, finance, people who come to this country to implement high-speed rail. I think there could be an opportunity there to help our Congress understand what really Buy America is about, right? It's about American. There's no dispute. It's about American jobs. Is it about making American widgets? No, it's about creating sustainable American jobs. So, I think that's Norman brought that up, and I think that's intriguing to me. And the second one was this idea that this tiered level of federal regulatory engagement or involvement in your project relative to the amount of federal funding. So Texas is sort of one extreme where there's no federal dollars, right? And they have very limited, but they're still subject to some federal oversight. But no matter, even on a RIF loan like was brought up around Desert Express, where they went after a RIF loan, that proved to be too difficult because of a Buy America clause that they had shut it down. Is there an opportunity to look at a tiered level of federal regulatory oversight based on your level of federal participation?
I heard a voice over here.
Another thing we talked
Just
about.
to finish the thought on that one, what Peter was saying.
Right.
That will also go into the environmental process. If it's a state-only project, and the state is putting up most of the money, the federal role can be, the processes can also be limited to, in a minimum, more an advisory role rather than a full role.
My kind of.
Some states it won't help.
Well, it won't help because it
Some
gets you
states are
around
full.
the transportation, the
Texas, I'm
DOT's
sure.
regulatory requirements, but it doesn't get you around all the other agencies. EPA, the Department of Interior's for Endangered Species, the Core 404 process. So you're getting into the concept of what we in the industry call the small federal handle, which limits
But
the
I'm
role.
saying, like in New Jersey, we were able to get out of the federal, and we did the state, and we went through all the approvals on the subject like because there's no federal money involved.
Dominic.
Oh. Sorry. No, one of the things we talked about a little bit, and Mike highlighted this a little bit, was the idea that we have to, unfortunately, the NEPA process has become synonymous for planning. And really, NEPA should not be the place where you actually plan and discuss the project. That should happen before you get into NEPA or whatever the state environmental process. I was so, talking on the finance panel about the fact that the uncertainty is just too great for any firm or any organization to really seriously consider funding it until it's done. But yet we need to have that discussion earlier to actually define the project, define the feasibility of the project. And I think if we did that and then entered process, we'd have a much better chance of getting it through the process in a timely way. I hate the fact that right now we go up, we gotta do NEPA, CEQA, and that's where we're gonna figure this all out. It's the most inefficient way to quote unquote figure a project out. And so as a planner, maybe it's self-serving, but we need to do more planning before we get into environmental clearance. I think that'll help also with the financials and the funding part of it.
One more comment, not on behalf of my group, but just as someone sitting out the audience. All of these topics, all three of them, if you want to fix NEPA, if you want to get more federal funding, if you want to develop a governance system that really works, they all rely heavily on political leadership, Congress primarily. And we talk about the technical issues, and what we lose sight of is the fact that these are politicians, and they can get behind something like this or anything as long as it's a positive message that they can send back, not just to their constituents, but to the world in general, because they're out there in the media. They get behind a lot of crazy things that are a lot more crazy than high-speed rail. So it's possible, just possible, that we might need a little help from some non-engineers, non-planners, to formulate a message that politicians can get behind. I mean, there are people out there that can get the masses to line up overnight to pay $600 for a phone and be the first person to get the phone. I mean, we don't need that. We just need to move it a little bit in that direction. And unfortunately, as an engineer, I have no way to help with suggestions on how to do that. But I'm sure there's some people that can help us.
Well, Mike can take on the NEPA effort, and I can take on the communication effort, and we'll have it all solved.
There you go.
Al?
Where is Paul Wyrick when you need him?
Yeah.
I know,
This is why.
okay.
Right.
But the question is, we don't have a Paul Wyrick, and we don't have a Frank Lautenberg. So how do we build a new champion or a series of champions? We've got to be building our champion now. We have 5 years in a new bill. We know pretty much what the layout is in terms of policy and the amount of funding. So we have 5 years to build ourselves some champions.
I would go back to one that didn't vote. We also have to be really clear about what our message is. I mean, I think as an industry, we've got to really look at ourselves and say, we're not doing a great job of selling high-speed rail. What is the message we really want to get to these champions to go and advocate for?
So perfect example of what was wrong with changing. I worked on the appropriations committee. I don't think it's every 5 years. I think it's every 1 year. You have to do this. As you saw, they put money in the bill, Fast Act for PTC, but no rail infrastructure. So you know where the priorities are. There was a choice. They chose that. During ARA, $800 million went from Portland to Seattle, and I was on the Republican Appropriations Committee at the time. And the press release from FRA said we're saving 2 minutes for $800 million. I called FRA. I'm like, take down that press release. I know it's more reliable. I know it's great. You're going to get a siding that will avoid a UP catastrophe with that commuter line or that University passenger line. But you can't say 2 minutes. I can't sell that. You win. Like, but that's 2 minutes. I'm like, 2 minutes, I don't care. Just put it as more reliable. The next press release said more reliable. That's easy to sell. I mean, you've all been stuck behind a train. It's terrible. So you need to kind of shift the message of speed and new things to, we're not going to break down. You know, tunnels, the best press we've been getting is the Gateway bridges, the Gateway tunnel.
That's a point made. I want to thank all of you for your input into your groups. Peter or Al, do you have some closing comments you want to make?
Thank you, everybody. We do have a hard stop at 2:30 because Apta's got to rearrange this room for the next party. I think that's happening later. You're all invited to at 5 o'clock. I think it's happening here. So. thank you very much for today. Today I found to be very informative, substantive, really good information. I was hoping to have a little bit of feedback from you today. If there was anything you wanted to hear, you didn't hear, any suggestions about what we could do better, I would like to propose that this is something we should do on an annual basis. I mean, I think it's a way of refreshing, a way of visiting this issue on a regular basis and keeping it current, and maybe even keeping a report card on ourselves to say, how are we doing? I would appreciate you email myself, Dominic, Al, Art, any comments, suggestions about how we can do this better, and I truly mean that. We want your feedback, because this is for you, or for us as an industry, and the more feedback we get, we can make it better next time. On that note, thank you everybody for your participation. Thought it was really great. And one more time for APTA and Al and Dominic, who really put all this together. You're all welcome back here at 5:30, right back here for a reception with APTA. So we have 3 hours of free time.